let's express an urban narrative that are going on. So let's just talk a little bit more about narrative. In kind of the class what we saw yesterday, the goal is for you guys to pick a narrative, right, that interests you and that gets you excited about making a series of really good images. Right? Construct a narrative, yes. Construct a narrative that makes you get excited about collaging, have an attachment to what it needs to be, and where you get that from, where your inspiration from, can be anywhere. It can be from comics, graphic novels, movies, photography, like any other medium. Right. So here's a comic book illustrator. It's got a 6-page book came out in the 90s called Here, and it's one view, the same view over and over again. And so this is a time-based narrative. And each little rectangle or little viewport, right, it's got a little date and time of that same view. So it's that same room that was constructed. They go over the room being built to what it looked like in the 1670s, to it's got the shark in the 21st century, to pilgrims being there. And you can construct one series of views, but across time, all that kind of happens. And there's not much text, there's not much words, but the story and narrative, how it's all laid out, is pretty powerful. Rather than a series of hues or tones to depict different places of time. So some of the stuff also is precedents from architecture schools and other schools of architecture in the UK and outside of the US that do narrative really, really well. So this is Bartlett School, Nick Ellis, for his thesis. So this was all the boards that he put up at the end of his graduation series was rendered image of Slough, an industrial town in England in the 1920s, where rather than going into board machining, he proposed an alternative narrative where they industrialized happiness. And so he collaged these views in the 1920s with Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh. So you can see Piglet and all the kind of stuff going on over here. And then the style or the tone of all these images is portrayed across the whole series, right? So the very stark background and honey color, everywhere, to rendered and photoshopped and different types of layers, to all the way down to his diagrams and final boards. That's injecting his, what is happiness and what is that, and how you want to model that doesn't necessarily be a look or smile. You could put different abstracts or constructs into your presentation to symbolize other things, right? The building has to be a building, so we just show that it's a building, show use, and so forth. So a series of kind of advertising shots of this fictionalized narrative of this place that he's interested in urbanistically. Another place, North by Northwest, probably one of my favorite films, very architectural film. So paintings of the UN building that they use in the scene, so a storyboard. This guy runs in, someone gets shot. Then there's the scene of him running out of the same building from above and kind of on. And then there's the famous scene in this movie of the
And so you guys see this, like, the narrative's pretty boring, right? Guy runs in, guy runs out. But the dynamic placement of these viewports or these vantage points actually make it kind of compelling. You see the action, you kind of see this desperation here, right? Because of the perspective of these images. So you want to think about the images and the way that you compose them as they relate to your narrative. We'll see more of that.
right. Close up, mid range, how far you're actually zooming in and zooming out. There's tons of examples of great. I'm sure you all have movies that you like inspired with good shots across the board. Okay. All right. So now we're gonna transition a little bit. Sun Tunnels is the greatest installation in Great Basin, Utah, done by Nancy Holt in 1976. What's great about this is there's lots of great images of this, but the sun, right, one of the most valuable light sources in all the renderings, and the mood and tone it has throughout different points of the day. So on the left there, so these tunnels there's holes carved into it based on different constellations that are mapped onto these tubes, these concrete tubes. So at night, the image on the left, the smaller one, that's glowing just by the glow of the stars. So say a night rendering, the sky is never 100% black, right? And in the dusk versus dawn versus noon, right? All have different moods and tones and feelings with them versus in the same season, right? Where the sun faces can kind of go. And so, right, there's an element of in the breaking down what makes a narrative or a story, right? The setting and seasonal and time is a part of your story that you need to know or comprehend or at least register in your overall scene. Is it, to kind of get everything, not necessarily physically accurate. I don't need to know it's May 2nd and what year, but the general overall mood that the sun can have in exterior shots is kind of what you're trying to get across there. So back to camera angles. So we touched on this a little bit last week, but looking at the storyboards, I think we need to go a little further into this. So horizontal canonical view. So then this is the easy view. This is eye level perspective, right? This is 75% to 80% of all images, right? This is the large swaths. This is either the boring or the really exciting type of view. So eye level, the subjective view, putting you in the scene, right? These types of views you can also convey meaning. So like a wide view frame in the lower left of an eye level shot also sets the mood or sets the place, right? It shows, right, gives you a wide viewing angle versus an eye level view that's very tall and it's very intimate. So the size and viewport of your frames means a lot to your image when you're trying to actually show.
I would say this is one of those perspectives or those camera angles that puts us in the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're a character. Right? So we may still be an observer, or we may not be an observer. So if you want to think about that, right? Are we part of the story, or are we simply viewing the story?
The other thing, these two aren't from the same image or common at all. But putting two images next to each other, there's an implied meaning that you get as the viewer out of it, right? Like looking at these cars beeping and seeing a shot of two people sitting at a table and chatting, like I think it's a noisy, not pleasant environment, right? And that's nowhere shown in the image on the right. It just covered up the one on the left. But the images you put next to each other, and that's montage theory in itself. We don't have time to go into that. But think of advertising and the shots in the montage and collages where they show you a Coke and they show you a woman's lips, right? And all the sexism in advertising and things like that. Like there's implied meaning between having a series of images up there. So you don't need to show me if your narrative is someone getting lost or something being stolen, them actually, all events of it. Someone's happiness when something's found, and someone looking around for stuff. I can draw the conclusion and don't need to see that person running away. In terms of your narrative and story. So you don't need every single image. There's implied meaning and frames in between. So bird's eye. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but so bird's eye view, there's something with how far and how zoomed out you are that can get pretty uncomfortable with it. Something to watch out for, what you do. But it's also used for establishing shots. You can do it to set up the zoom in, or it could also be the end of a chapter or sequence of images. So like everyone's happily ever together and you see them snug in their house, right? Zoomed out could be at the end or the front. Different ways of flashbacking. Sets up a mood typically, right? If it's the first image, it gives you the conveying of the scene. It's also can be used as a negative connotation, right? If I'm zooming in on you right now, I'm looking down on all of you, right? My bird's eye view is making, if it was a shot of all of you, like you are subservient to me, whereas your shot is an ant's view, which we'll get into next, right? Where I am more powerful because I'm higher up and you're all looking up. And those, getting low to the ground, there's a high amount of tension based on where the subject is. The closer the subject you are in an ant's view, there's not much tension. Like the woman on the bed is kind of nice, but walking out, storming out of the room, the tension in that, the further the subject is away from your ant's view, the more, say, connotation that can be implied into it, more dramatic it can kind of feel. and just fragments and things. The other thing is looking up on people, right? Every movie or say TV show that has politicians or the president speaking, right? They're always filmed at a low angle to give them a bigger aurora of the presence. So if your character or someone in your scene is doing something of a large accomplishment, right? You kind of want to be looking up at it. This one, which I think to do, you kind of need a really good narrative or a reason, or maybe seeing this image makes you revise your image so it's something you want to use. But a tilted camera angle is kind of eerie and has a negative connotation to it. Something's wrong, right? It's very implied and directive. But to do it out of nowhere and not without a good setup, it loses all meaning. And right, it's odd, so it needs to be good intent to it. So is it, the famous shot in horror and action movies where the broken glasses are on the ground looking through at the post-apocalyptic world or whatnot. So now we're going to get into camera angles. So in Rhino, there's lens length on your setup camera. So one thing for everyone who's using Mental Ray and 3DS, for Mental Ray, any camera setup you do in Rhino, you have to do again in Mental Ray, typically. So just be aware of that as a way to go. But there's lens length, and then in most rendering software, there's physical cameras. So lens length and focal length are inverse relationships or opposite things. So lens length is your basic default camera in Rhino when you go to properties, right? An 18 is a wide lens and lens length, so you capture more of the image. And a 40, so both my cameras in the same spot, and I just changed the lens length of the same image. And then your focal length, so for this rendering, right, is does the same thing but acts on the actual camera itself. And so low number is wider, and a higher number is more zoomed in. So it's kind of the opposite relationship. And so I'm probably going to be showing through the sequence of images about this project that I worked on, but say time frame reference, 3 days, one other person, and 5 images. So let's go into image making. So there's kind of different genres, you could say, or categories of rendering styles. A lot of the examples we saw yesterday were photorealism. For those in Thomas's lecture, he kind of railed on it pretty heavily. But it's a valid style of technology.
Yeah, so right, we're looking at these images. I'm going to jump through these really quickly. And we'll sort of talk back through them. Right, all of these are sort of photorealistic. Maybe there's some are paintings, but each of them. So taking a view, right, of let's say the traditional like stuff you see in Architizer or whatever, right? All of those images, they have a certain attitude, right? It's to make the building look as good and sexy and interesting as possible, right? The audience is non-architects, it's people buying those projects. And so what we're saying, at least with these images, is if you're going to use any style, right, you should have a sort of agenda, right, a statement, especially with camera angle. But even the way that you present it, like this image here, right, like this is just creepy and strange, right? So obviously there's something behind this. There's a bit of a story. It's not just how does this look real, right? That's not the goal with any of these. Maybe it's a realistic style, but it's not about making something real, right? This is just a strange. There's this sort of disgusting stickiness of this image, right? Which is it's evocative. So, and any of your images, they should have some quality and some stance, right? This one is just a composition. It's interesting. It's gritty. There's a sort of sensibility about the urban environment here. This one, right? Clearly, it's realism, but it's also high contrast, right? It's sort of realism to comic book-ish, right? So, but there's still a sort of narrative style. There's a tone to this. So it's okay to use this particular style, but you have to have sort of an agenda. And we can look at, yeah, sure.
So just on that line of photorealism and use in architecture, it's interesting because in planning, sometimes we will use it, but there's frequently a tendency to go towards things like watercolors and so on and so forth. And there's an important reason for that. When a client contracts you to design a building, they expect a finished product, right? When the client contracts you to design a whole neighborhood, you're really selling the concept. And often what you're selling is something like the land use planning and just some general form-based ideas about how a neighborhood would be. If you deliver to your client a photorealistic rendering of an entire neighborhood, the client's going to have a problem when they show that to the public. The public thinks that that is what it's going to end up being exactly, and you get into problems with that. So there's a tendency to go towards these more representational things like watercolors, very vague, right? Because number one, you can't guarantee that the neighborhood's going to build out like that, and number two, it's just a safer bet when you're going to have to go through multiple iterations of public input. You don't want a finished rendered product, right? You want
But
something
also,
very vague.
the goal is to sell a kind of place, right?
Right.
The potential for a place.
And you can get a lot more emotion out of, Plater, Zyber, Duane is a firm. Duane, I've gotten the order mixed up. It's DPZ, Duane, Plater, Zyber, that is a new urbanist firm, right? And almost everything they do is a watercolor that conveys an emotion that is typically a very sweet, happy, almost bucolic even for being a city mood, which is part of what they're selling, right? This is going to be a lovely community to come home to. And the people buying those products aren't interested in coming home to a hyper-rendered community, right?
So but not even about what we do, what you guys do in the studio, right? Is you're trying to convey a concept and energy across, right? And you can do that in any of these styles or categories we're going to go through.
Right.
But a photorealistic, make this look like it's real at your midterm, it's probably not the best use of your time, right? And it's a skill, right? And there's a way of modeling and rendering throughout the process of you doing stuff, where it needs to relate to kind of the agenda where you're trying to get across. So whether you do decide to get really good at some type of software or Photoshop or whatever, but drawing is a way of thinking, and modeling is how and 3D modeling is how I do drawing today and what I do.
And we'll see that all of these are kind of the same, right? Like, you don't get to this image, any of these, without any of the other two methodologies, right? So we're looking here now at collage, right? So this is Speedism, sort of theory of architecture, right? Pretty weird, pretty bizarre, but this is all Photoshop, all done in Photoshop. Here's an example of what Michael was just talking about, right? So probably no rendering, just layering stuff up, coming up with images. Maybe some rendering to get a sense of what the physical space is, but also collage, which is totally balanced, just quick, very quick. Here's another example. In each of these, I think you can see, like, it's intentional. They're trying to tell you that this is not a photograph, right? It's built up. This one is a juxtaposition of just strange elements, but still a collage, right? Again, here, this is clearly a collage. The interesting thing is they're using, right, these angles, they're using these textures and the way that they've clipped them to reinforce perspective, something we went over last week. Here's another great example. This sort of ephemeral, right? The same kind of ephemeral quality that we might see in let's say, a Lexicon rendering here. It's just a little grainier. This says maybe this is not 2015, but maybe some other time, right?
That's a rendering. That's all.
Yeah. Right. So this is some rendering and some collage, which is initially what we'll want to get to. Here's a great collage, right? Student, this is recent. Scanned, so drawing. So even though we're talking about rendering and we're talking about this, you guys can scan your sketches and include those parts, right? If you could produce craft that is as compelling as anything we've seen, then anything is valid. So non-photorealistic rendering. So this is a technique, right? Here we've got rotoscoping. So too, or the camera view, right? So we are actually participating, right? We are this person just sitting here in the water. So we are participatory, not just looking in at this. Another good example, right? Mood. So even stop motion, right? Stop motion, taking an image. Another example of stop motion, right? So those are valid methodologies. Illustrative. We all know the sort of line work, right? This one here as well. Here's a great example, right, of narrative telling a story. In this case, it's how the movie goes together and how it's used. More examples, sketches, right? How do any of those things happen? Well, everything is a process of layering, right? So any one of those styles could, the sort of boundary is blurred, but they're all built upon layering. So if you think of cellular animation, early animation, right? It's a series of foreground, middle ground, background, right? And elements in between that compose this element, or compose the final image. So if you think about that, you could achieve any one of those styles and you could cross the boundary, but you could also have a greater degree of control. So this sort of thinking and this way of producing an image is not, it's about freedom, it's about control, it's about being able to be very specific. So, Chris?
Okay, so lighting, right, so kind of getting back into the state of Rhino, or any modern software, right, there's emissive materials, there's directional lights, which is this one, right, pointing the light at it, there's different types of shadows, and your settings of what your render can produce, right, how hard the shadow is, how intense the light is. The more intense the light, the softer the shadows in most rendering softwares. Typically, but the brighter they are, right? And then there's light bounces off the shadow. So how rendering software typically works, if you go back to this image, right? Here's my camera. This is what I have modeled. The computer makes a picture plane, and it draws in all these elements that you have modeled that have material. Right? There's lights that you have in your model up here. All those lights go to the materials, and the materials draw that all back to where your camera is located. Right? So all those, it calculates the value of those pixels and adds up to that to get an actual color. So in that, there is the direct light of your light hitting the object and being the very bright image. There's the indirect light, where there's the global illumination of the actual scene, but there's also secondary bounces, which is what's kind of being shown in these two panels on the right. So there's the light from the shadow that's being cast going back on the object itself. There's the light from the material, right? If a shiny red object, right? It's casting a little bit of red hue on the actual box next to it. There's lights bouncing back in between those. And so that's known as secondary bounces. So when your rendering software works, it does the primary bounces first, and then does the secondary bounces, and you can set different domains on how many secondary bounces and all those other types of things. But that's kind of the overall philosophy of this image in your computer screen, right? Everything's drawing back to where the actual camera lens is, and just renders the picture frame, right? It doesn't render anything outside of that. You don't need a, right? This is the Hollywood lot set, but your camera angle is set up to see and do is where you need to put the detail and all the extra work into making the image gray. Another way of breaking out light. So, right, type in light, Rhino, right? There's a panel of different options. There's point lights. There's spherical light. There's point lights. There's directional lights, which is kind of the sun. There's tube lights. There's planes. All of those types of stuff, right? Anything you see in this type of environment, right? It's easy to recreate. So you can have the object, the point light itself, and you can see all the different shadows that are being cast on there from how close they are to the actual surface, right? So that's the emissive material. You can also make materials glow. There's the directional light, which is pointing down at the scene, right? So that's your sun angle, the azimuth, and the altitude. Probably get to know that in your technical classes, hopefully. Right, what angle the sun is at? Is it across north? Is it not? and all the shadows cast on the scene. The shadows at noon, right, are different from early in the morning. There's tone lights, and there's multiple lights, and how shadows change when you have more than one light in the center, right? So, looking at most images yesterday, right, and kind of that 9 shades of gray that we talked about last week, you need more than global illumination in your scene to create a compelling image. You need to.
Oh.
Yeah. Question? Yeah. What program is this? This is. I mean, any program can do these. These are drawings in Illustrator.
Yeah, this is
Like this.
basic lighting. Every single rendering engine has a point light, has a rectangle light, has global illumination. These are just general concepts from light to rendering to any. So it's not, we're not dictating the program, we're looking at concepts of lighting.
Right? So lighting has different scales, and they're all, right, and how strong the light is does change, right? Every light has lumens, as of right, when I pick out light fixtures for a building, there's connotations to how bright it is, right? So these on the stage are different from the exit signs and so forth. And kind of that goes on. So back to layering. One thing, since we all work with the computer now, organization is key. I don't know if you guys haven't worked or not. After a week of working, you will clearly learn that how you organize and use your files is very critical to your sanity and other people and being nice to other people. So having a nested folder structure, right? So this is the rendering I've shown. This is all that I modeled. This is like a quarter of all my layers that I have there. One thing that I recommend is your 2D line work should be in a different nested folder than all your 3D work. If you have, we talked about level of development a little bit last week, so how much detail you get into. If you have all vertical walls on the same layer, it's going to be hard to make some of the images we have if you start adding multiple materials. So think about when we get into materiality next week, and you're modeling this week, think about where you want to put different types of materials, so you don't have to go back in and change them all to a different other layer.
You can also be thinking about this image here, right? So the layering structure. So if something's in the foreground, the middle ground, or the background, you might want to break up your Rhino model that way, right? Because you're going to render different parts of that image at different times. So you want to really be planning ahead and giving yourself a lot of freedom to turn certain things off, turn certain things on, put multiple materials on different elements. So layering is really important in terms of how you plan to use the geometry, right?
Multiple lights in different layers. I have multiple suns depending on my different shots in the scene. Nice command that I think you all should use is view floating viewport. Right? So you can create a viewport that's the same proportion as your final output image to actually know what's going on in the scene. Right? And so the size of your rendering and your output, right, it's helpful if you can actually know where you're actually going to render it. Same thing with that. There's file capture to view. It's a command that saves whatever in your viewport as a JPEG or a PNG file. Right? Using name views, saving your views constantly, like you can't trust it. Having different lighting situations or folder structures for each different scene. So these are all 4 different scenes that I had all in the same file. Each same per view, each had different turn on and off. You can even say what layers are on and off in each main view. You can also, one thing I recommend looking into, it's not necessary for this class, but you can have work sessions in Rhino. So a work session is, I had a separate Rhino model while I was working on this with someone else, where he modeled I was modeling the building and he placed all the furniture. We had the same origin point, so I could just bring all of that file into my file, all the materials map, and render it. So you can be working on you can work session in multiple models into the same model and render everything. So you it helps with file size and dexterity and speed. But based on that, you need proper layer bending. So having everyone use the same kind of connotations and setup is helpful. So when Joel's modeling it, my work session in, I don't have to pick and choose. If you do the same stuff on the same layer, and I'm trying to change everything to green or whatnot, I'm able to do that. Right, so these are, and the scene that we'll get to and see a lot, these are all my lights that I set up. So this guy right here, that's my sun, it's my directional light. We have my camera set up in this hero image I had. Stairs shown for some context. Lots of plane lights, they're all different tubes. Right, these are kind of my sun settings that I use, right? I can move the sun based on the time of day that I want it to, or I can just kind of place it and put it in and be directional. So sun and directional light can be the same thing. You can change the ozone and different weird things with the sun. Lots of stuff just kind of deep dive into, you know, like, so my lecture's an hour, right? There's a need for another 2 hours on your end to dive into the actual software and music, right? At least. We kind of do all that. Greater intensity of your lights, the brighter the sources, but the softer the shadow is a concept across all rendering softwares, right? So my tube lights were greater intensity, they were brighter in the image, but then they didn't cast as much weird shadows, right?
So all of these settings. Yeah. So this is one example of render settings, right? So this is V-Ray inside Rhino. V-Ray is the same across all V-Ray plugins. So you want to, you know, maybe mess with here's some camera settings. We're not going to dig into any of this too much, other than maybe output, right? So you might have a Rhino viewport window of, let's say 900 by 600, but your final rendering might want to be 10,000 at the longest, right? You need higher resolution.
Okay, so, right, so there's a little website in the corner. You guys will get this. Or you use Google Pixel Inches Converter. So DPI is the resolution your image comes out at, right? I don't like looking at anything less than 150 DPI if it's printed, right? It's plotted and it's a nice plot. Like if I'm doing the stuff that goes up on billboards or on groundbreaking ceremonies, 300 DPI, high resolution plotter, that's what we want to be at. For my own internal test, print out 11.5 by 11 with 72 DPI. And all that is key in any image that you're making and what's kind of going on and understanding the size that you render an image affects it. So,
And again, this is what I want to stress back at the beginning, right? This idea here, right? So when you're trying to render a 300 DPI or a 150 DPI image that's 10,000 pixels at its maximum length, you're probably not going to be able to render everything at once. So you have to do some kind of layer management. Rhino, you've got to do some kind of layer management with the way that you layer your lights. So you might render maybe the global illumination separate from key lights. So being specific with how you're setting that up, thinking about it, will save you a lot of headaches when you get to this step.
but I can't get to this step unless I storyboard it out and go back and pick my 4 views and what size I actually want those at, right? Like knowing what image I'm supposed to create and not knowing what story I'm trying to get across. Of this is your entrance shot, this is from the side and so forth. This is my axon to show kind of what it is, right? So that was a quick competition where I had 3 days and I didn't draw any plans because it was a waste of my time. Okay, we got a project because I made a lot of pretty images with the plan. Okay.
So render channels, guys. So this is something that you may not be familiar with, but just like layers in Rhino, just like layers in QGIS, just like layers in Photoshop or Illustrator, when you render something out, you have the ability to render out different channels or passes that might be different in whatever software you're using. But you've got color, material, object, UV, ambient occlusion, the environment, emissives, shadow, specular. One thing I would want to point you guys to is in all of your, let's say, even now if you're rendering everything, you should be rendering everything in gray, right? You could create multiple gray materials and give them different color IDs because that will help you as you move into Photoshop.
But the other thing, so the computer, right, when you hit render, if you don't have these checked, it is still going to run it. Like it calculates the diffuse, the shadow, all the specular to make your final output image. It takes slightly a little longer to get all those, but not really. And then there you can have more control when you move into Photoshop. So
Yeah,
this is an example of all the different
If we look at this, the image on the left is typically what we think about when we think about a render, right? That's the diffuse color. It's everything combined. But here, this person is, they've got layers of light, right? They've got a left light, they've got a right light, they've got rim lighting, rim light left, rim light right, specular. The SSS is subsurface scattering, right? That's light coming through the material. Then they've got reflection, normals, could be useful. All the different shadows, ambient occlusion, depth, and maybe a mask. And so the image on the upper left is composed of all of those, but this person has said, I'm going to separate all those out because I know later I'm going to want to have a fine-grained control over those. I might want a greater intensity on that rim light, right? And rather than go back and bump up that key light in their rendering engine and hit re-render, they're going to give themselves a series of layers as a way to post-process this.
So kind of based on what we saw yesterday, which is default matte stuff, I guarantee you that most of your other render software stuff would have better grayscale and better tones than the images you guys pinned up. That was all right in the background, right? So like most of the shadow stuff was probably more compelling than some of the images that were, you know, this. Occlusion, right? Render occlusion is just like the soft gray tones when light's dark is, you know, is a render style.
Yeah, ambient occlusion here, right? You kind of see that everywhere. The traditional sort of gray.
Another one that's helpful is there's render ID and material ID.
So now you can see a render ID is essentially the computer is segmenting out the objects in the order in which they're rendering. It kind of does this for you.
And the color that it comes in.
Yeah,
Right.
right. So if we look at material ID, right, these you set, and you have to take some time and some initiative to do this, but the reason why you would do this, and we'll see a slide later where they're properly placed in Photoshop, is now I've got all of my materials set in my rendering, I've rendered it, and I've got a map, I've got a selection map I can use in Photoshop. I can select this particular color and only select this area, and then I can manipulate that section, right?
I can render the stair whatever color I want the stair to be, and because I have the purple layer there, I can just select that exact color and constantly change just in Photoshop what I want it to be. I can make the glass a brick wall, you know, and just do that all in Photoshop. So same thing kind of when we get into the image itself, right? When I'm in Photoshop, my layer organization is key, so I have at the bottom, I have all those, I call render, and it's got all my my diffuse, all my different maps I throw down at the bottom. I do a couple adjustment layers to those. And then at the top, I this is preference, it's how you work. I keep my render ID and material ID at the top so it's easy to get to it. So I can make different, so I can make different view masks and things like that.
So one thing here, guys, the way that I think about this is I think about anything on top is foreground, right, middle ground, and background, because that's how Photoshop works. Anything at the bottom is behind, because anything you put on top of it is going to be in front of it. So conceptually, when we think about that cellular animation, right, we've got background, middle ground, foreground, and then maybe any sort of adjustments, global adjustments. Above that, obviously, are your selection masks.
Right. And then at the top, I got my entourage, my people, my paintbrushes. If I want to give it a more mood, if I want to get very atmospheric with it, right? If I want to vignette all the corners and make it a little darker to draw you in, all those type of stuff happens on top. So this is the rendering. This is what I got out of the computer, right? This is what I did, and this is just after adjustment layers. I didn't know Photoshop worked. I just used different adjustments and layers, curves, and hue bumps to those different layers that came out, and that took that to this. So no actual coloring or painting or so forth. No collaging yet. I did render all the furniture. Right, and then this is my layer of putting all the people in, creating all the shadows, right? Let me go back real quick to
This is the raw.
Yeah.
So note on this, guys, one thing I want to point out that's not clear on here. So Chris May, I'm going to guess that he used V-Ray on this one, but Chris May also had used something like Maxwell, or maybe this is V-Ray, right? And maybe he doesn't even know what the materials are. We're just checking lighting. Okay, if I'm checking, the first thing I do when I set up any render is I also set up a Photoshop file, and I'll do something called place. Instead of opening my render file, I will open that file, and And then I will immediately place that object, that same file, in the file and delete out that file, the original layer that I opened. The reason why you do that is because it's kind of like an XREF, it's a link. And so what you have is called a smart object. And so now I re-render I make some adjustments. I scale that thing, I move it around, and maybe I'm scaling and collaging it to fit in, but I re-render that image, right? I now have added materials. Well, all I have to do is right-click on that placed object and replace the object, and it remembers all of those things that I've done, right? So linking is crucial for me. And also, if you just you right-click and copy to create a new one, you can do the same thing for all of your layer masks and your layer selections.
Okay. So now we're gonna bounce some line work, right? Axon drawings, diagrams, all these tools of
Or even
collage of the profession, right? Right. So it makes me line work.
So here's a mixture, right? So we're looking at partial rendered components. So if we go back to the beginning, right? We've got the image on the left is literally a textured map, a rendered object with color, and then line work over that. So here again, layering, right? Everything is built up through layering, through managing and manipulating Illustrator. You could even do the same thing. You could slap this object into Photoshop and have a vector smart object. So any one of those things you guys want to focus on, into any one of those styles or whatever you're interested in, you need to be thinking about how you're going to produce the image from its, let's say, spatial foreground, midground, background layering to how you're going to manipulate the components after you get a rendering, when you do a drawing that you want to overlay on that, when you want to scan something, when you want to collage in a sky, right? So you want to be thinking about that and setting up. So the whole point of this is really it's just about layering and being specific about how you do that. So just to reiterate, right? This is what we're looking at. We're still sort of iterating through the first 4 right now. Maybe we do a little bit of Photoshopping. Maybe we're setting up the Photoshop file, starting to try to figure out that. But we're really not worried about materials right now, guys. Maybe you're thinking about it, but we're not looking specifically at it. So here's just the general strategy, right? Rhino, render, whatever that is, Photoshop and Illustrator. That's the methodology that we're using. That's what you want to be. Render is whatever render engine you want to use. And this is the loop. Set yourself up for a loop. Know that you're going to have to replace stuff, so figure out how to iterate quickly through this loop.
A couple more stuff to kind of go over some of the stuff I talked about. More round commands that are pretty helpful and quick to use. Right, one command I don't have on here is command list. It brings up a text file. I've ever seen command in Rhino. More than McNeil tutorial we have down there. Photoshop commands, or say things to know in Photoshop, right? Smart objects give you dexterity. You can flip a person. You can in your Photoshop file you can transform or shear, but then the file that's being linked is native and not damaged, right? It's non-destructive Photoshop. So when we make you move some entourage elements, you collage the person in there because the table's at a weird spot in the shot. You can just kind of move the table and re-render, and then your person doesn't have a hole through it where there used to be a table. Right? So layer masks allow you to say, if you're looking at me, right, you can cover up all the part that's the color coding, but my Photoshop is still all of me. Some more Rhino resources. Websites, there's millions out there to kind of go at.
There's a couple of tutorials on here, guys. Well, there's some examples of different blogs. There's some tutorials that you should go look at. Some interesting videos you should look at. A couple of really good like Photoshop collaging tutorials where they just manipulate purely without images to produce stuff. And really, that's what you want to be like focusing on your skills, right? Understanding how you're doing this. We can point stuff out all day on the computer up here and have you point and click and follow along, but that's not going to help. You got to practice. So,
And get some references. Like you guys have 2-3 years left in your curriculum here. Like the goal for this should be framing yourself up. So in 2 years from now, you can achieve some of this great stuff, right? there's just a frame around it to kind of get your energy across. Right, there's a narrative here. It's satire. It's critiquing how shitty buildings we produce for the population. This guy, right? Different types of axonometric coloring, other types of techniques, borders, so forth. Your accent could be very selective to what you want to actually show.
Yeah, so you can see like taking that simple illustration that we showed earlier of using Illustrator to the next level. So we've got great rendering, we've got great line work, right? So this just doesn't come out of the computer when you click render or you click maybe 2D, right? You're gonna actually put some effort, some craft into it. Are there any questions so far? We'll step through another example here that Thomas Grins put together. Very simple. I imagine this took him about 20 minutes. And he didn't use anything specific other than Rhino, right? With Illustrator. So here's it looks like it's the make 2D command, where he's taken that viewport, created some line work.
Here's a
Pretty simple, straightforward render, raw render right from Rhino inside Rhino on the Mac, which is a capable renderer, but it's not, let's say, the Ferrari that Maxwell is or V-Ray. So clearly you could, or whatever, so you could simply use the renderer right in Rhino and get decent results. It's got all the values. Now it's got some line work, right, from Make 2D. I would argue that he may have wanted to go into what I would do typically. Make 2D, I might edit all that Make 2D line work, right? Join all this stuff together, put it on separate layers in Rhino itself because it's easier to manipulate the geometry there than it is here. So then we've collaged in a background.
The frame of the background doesn't have to be the full image. A nice architectural technique is this harkens back to the 80s and drawing on top of really crappy renderings, right? And drawing more detail, so extending the life of the design. It's like Florida, Pierre Gomez, they all do this a ton. Right? And then this is Illustrator and Photoshop, right? This is all Illustrator.
Yeah.
So this is all pen moving the width, creating some tone, and diagram, like to say 10 minutes. And then some mask, bring some more line work in. If you save your views, you can go add more detail and get more line weights. If you export, if you layer everything properly, you can get different names of all the line weights that come into Illustrator. You can also use pen styles, tactical drawing, and they come with some edge. You can make your own pen styles in Rhino. Right? This is all, all in Illustrator. Right then, now projects and vectors, making some weird stuff, throwing some trees in, and then cooking. And that is something you should all be able to do
20 minutes.
before a midterm.
Yeah, you should be able to, this is like, to me, this would be something that I might do really quickly to get an image up for an idea, right? I'm not saying this is the final, but we can quickly get to something, right? Using this idea of layering and control. And that's really what it's about. Right?
You guys have any questions? Otherwise, we're just going to show a video.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So yesterday, I go and get our product versus zero and a half. Yesterday, I just wanted to remind that we had requested for Maxwell, you can get a free student license for professors, email Maxwell or a local distributor. I sent Thompson based on it.
Okay.
So you can take care of that. I don't know how long it'll take after it's on and all that.
Okay, yeah. Email the TA, she'll collect that stuff, and then send us that
She has
information.
all our emails.
She has all our email information, so just coordinate. Anything like that, coordinate with the TA, and she'll coordinate with us, because I don't want to try to email 50 different people, right? And do it 50 different times. I'd rather do it one time. But yeah, certainly, we can make that. It's a file. But again, so this one is just, 3D Studio Max, rendered, bizarre, right? You can imagine one simple material mapped on this. It's not meant to be realistic, but there is sort of a realistic quality, right? But there's an agenda to it. These guys do a lot of collage. It's bizarre.
So we don't have to watch the whole thing, but any questions? So get organized. I would say get organized.
What I told my students is if I do get these assignments, right? We get these assignments in the office, but the first thing I would do is just
Set up my model, set up my basic views, use the view capture to capture those views,
print those out, sketch over them as my
storyboard, make sure that it makes sense, right? So we're using the digital tools to help storyboard.
we're collaging, we're figuring that out, and then we're iterating. And if you just think of it as iteration and not I have to get this final image out all in one go,
You're going to be much more successful than you will if you try to push it all in one go, right? Like if you worry about modeling a doorknob and you don't even know if your camera fits your narrative, then you're going to be in big trouble.
So I think I at least want more detail in the model this go around, right?
Shadow and light. Boxes are not just enough, but I don't want you modeling bricks, right? Maybe you model a cornice if it needs to be modeled.
Maybe you hint a little bit at some physical arbitrage,
but so an appropriate kind of level of detail for where we're at, but not crazy, right? Don't model bricks, doorknobs, window mullions. Unless you need a window mullion because you're trying to cast a shadow into an interior environment, and that cast shadow is part of composition, right? So
Sketching out, reword all your storyboards, right? If you want to change or develop your narrative to something you're more interested in, by all means do it. Right? I've done a lot of that thing. And then draw it out, but then collage it, right? Make it 2D and start throwing some more things into it and get behind the intent. Have some people and have some as a picture trying to go through and show. And it's all the examples you guys have shown are if you've been to the speed and how fast this takes is all just due to how long you've been doing it and how long you get comfortable with it. So, we have 3 more weeks. It's a ton of time to kind of get a connection. This is weird.
yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So the lecture will be posted, right? Let's go quickly over the assignment. Let's pull this up.
So some information about having a statement about having an attitude, having something that you want to say, an imagery that isn't just trying to sell something, right? But having a specific attitude and a statement with the imagery that you're making is where you really want to pick up, right? And then really we're just refining. We're going to revisit everything, right? So again, more modeling. We're going to model for photographs if you need to. You're going to render. You're still going to choose whatever rendering. We're still in the clay rendering stage, right? But I would stress that even though we're in the clay rendering stage, be thinking about how you might put materials in your scene, and be thinking about that with the way you're layering things in Rhino, and maybe just creating a simple clay material and then duplicating that multiple times, changing the material ID of that so that way you can begin to understand and see what material ID map is and how it's used and how you might use it through selection in Photoshop. And then you can use technical illustration. You can use Make 2D. There are
there are really two kinds of ways to go about this. You can simply type make 2D in Rhino viewport, get some line work, clean that up, bring it into Illustrator, or you could use a non-photorealistic rendering engine such as Freestyle, right, which is going to do all of that sort of technical layering style, but also render it and give you the same level of control without the sort of mechanical means and the slow process of drawing. So there's a link at the end of the lecture that has some information about how you might go about doing that. And then again, we're going to revise our narrative, right? So revise the narrative. If you need to add more and find the compelling points, you need to completely rework it. You know what you need to do. And then we're rendering those storyboard elements, right? Render the element, and rendering the element doesn't mean hit render necessarily. It could be going into Rhino and using the view capture to image and storyboarding those, putting those together, writing on them, right? Figuring out, okay, you know, Jane is here and she's looking that way because of whatever reason. I know that I need a harsh shadow and it's nude or whatever. Really planning, right? So then come up with some precedents, guys. Like have an attitude. Find some images that have attitude, right? That you're after, not just like, you know, and it could be whatever you're interested in, have some attitude. And then you guys really need to render and work on synthesizing that technique. Each person needs at least one rendering frame. I would say you should take a pass at rendering all of the frames in your sequence because you're going to need to do it again and again, right? That's the only way you're going to get better, but minimum one per student. And so we saw in 20 minutes, Thomas put together pretty quickly, right? Using very simple techniques. We saw Chris was able to do 5 pretty good images in 3 days because of this ordered structure. And that had materials, so don't worry about that. I don't know, that's really all I have to say. Any questions? Is anybody not clear on what they're doing, right? I don't know what to do. Do we not know what the deliverables are? So you all know what is due, so you all show up with what is due. Good. Is anybody stuck on picking a software for rendering? No? Okay. For those of you that are interested in Maxwell, I would very much look at how you're going to manipulate Photoshop in conjunction with while that thing's rendering, because I imagine it'll take 2 days to get a good image. Just considering the laptops that everybody has and the crappy horsepower we have here.